USCHO.com.
Welcome to USCHO Edge for Friday, October 28th, 2022, where each week we handicap and prognosticate some top games this weekend. This podcast is sponsored by DCU Digital Federal Credit Union. What will DCU mean to you? Find out today by visiting dcu.org, membership required. I'm Ed Trefzger alongside Jim Connelly and Dan Rubin. Well, guys, we're going to start out with a game we actually talked about on Spotlight earlier this week with Jess Myers from the Rink Live. Some Big Ten action as number one Minnesota travels to Ohio State. Minnesota, not a gigantic favorite. Seems like this is going to be a pretty good contest this weekend.
I think it should be. Just on paper, the two teams pretty close in terms of how they match up. Minnesota a minus 140 favorite. Ohio State just a slight underdog, plus 110. I look at Minnesota as being in danger, if anything, of maybe just the emotional letdown. I know Jess Myers mentioned that on Spotlight. Last week was such an emotional series at home against North Dakota, your big rival. You had two unbelievable games. If there's any advantage, and I'm not saying a loss is ever an advantage, but maybe the fact that they didn't win on Saturday, Minnesota might make them a little hungrier going into Friday, but it's one of those situations where, you might have to create some of your own atmosphere, create some of your own emotion if you're playing in this game.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, Jimmy. My only thing about Minnesota right now is that one is that because I really wanted to say Ohio State was going to win this, and I realized how badly I picked the games last week. That's exactly why I'm picking Minnesota. I mean, I took a anybody who wants to listen to me on last week took a bath. I didn't take a bath. Everyone else did though. But the Minnesota team, when you look at what happened and how they got to number one on just in general in the rankings, it was a kind of a chaotic start. And I think when you to the weekend, it was a chaotic weekend, I should say. So when I watch how all of these things kind of break down, I really do feel like as the number one team, they need to show something in a matchup like this. And like you said, create some of that emotion that maybe they lost after they had or didn't have on the second night against North Dakota. So I think they're primed for a breakthrough. I think Ohio State lining up is a intriguing matchup on the road and can kind of galvanize them. I don't know if they're going to win the whole weekend, but for what we're looking at with the Gophers, I certainly like them to at least split and probably take the first game, and then second game all bets are off.
The over-under on that game is 6, and one of the players that is talked about for Ohio State on which the whole game could hinge is their 6'4" netminder, Jacob Dobish. 6 points, is 6 goals? Is that a good over-under?
It's kind of right there on me. Yeah. I mean, you saw last week, both of their games right around that number. I think it was 5 and 7. So 6 looks kind of in the middle. And I don't think the opponent changes things too much. You do have a good goaltender, obviously, but you had Drew Ritter was a pretty good goaltender last week. I think that these teams will get up and down the ice. 6, probably right around the number. That's a bet I would just, really shy away from.
Yeah, I'd avoid that one like the plague. I feel like that's one of those where if it were 7, you take the under. If it's 5, you take the over. But 6 just kind of feels like it's begging to ruin everyone's weekend.
Yeah, even 6.5, I'd be okay with taking the 6, like taking the under and hoping you get there.
Another matchup within a league has number 9 Boston University at number 18 UMass Lowell, a slight favorite for Lowell in this one.
Yeah, Friday, the first of 2 games, BU was an even money underdog. So I always shrivel up when I have to say that. UMass Lowell, the slight favorite, minus 130. The over-under on this game just 5.5. I think that, the books definitely respect the fact that these teams are pretty good defensively. Both have been proven over the years to have good goaltending. There's a lot of historical data being used in setting this line. Lowell has been better at home against BU over the years. They have a really tough time down at Aganis. So this makes sense. And I wouldn't be surprised to see on Saturday night's rematch when the line comes out on that. You just have the line exactly flipped around. That over under, it's very similar to what we just said about Minnesota. That's a tough one. You're talking about 3-1, 3-2, 2-1, 3-0, 1-0, 2-1. There's not a lot of combinations to get you under 5.5. So if you're gonna bet this one, I'd probably go the over, and you hope that you maybe it's a 3-2 game late and you get an empty netter for 4-2. But that again is one of those lines that's right on the edge, and I wouldn't touch that over under. I do like Lowell at home in this one though. I think that's a good number for them, -130. You're getting some value if you make that bet against a BU team that nobody really knows yet where they're going to be. They've had some good games. They've had some really bad games. I think of 9-2 loss at Michigan. So if they can come out and play well, they could be dangerous for Lowell. Lowell's coming off a nice win at Northeastern last weekend. So maybe you catch Lowell, maybe looking past, but I know the emotion that goes into playing BU for Coach Norm Bazin. When he was at UMass Lowell as a student, this was their number one rival. So he tends to get his teams up to play BU.
Jimmy, there are two things in here that I guess I come back to. One, Stranger Things night in Lowell. So strange things are going to happen. I've never watched an episode of that show, and I really feel like I should. But that's another conversation for another day. Number two is Lowell has been slow to start 2-game weekends. I know there've only been 2 weekends where they've played multiple games, but they lost at home to Miami in the first game. They lost at Michigan State in the first game. If this weekend was flipped, if this weekend was at BU on Friday at home against Lowell, I think it'd be a no-brainer. I'd say Lowell's going to win at home. I'd say BU is going to win at home. I think moving the game to Songus on Friday, or having the game at Songus, I should say, on Friday, kind of changes the dynamic of how you try to look at it. But if you're dealing with some of the data stuff, I would probably stay away from this one personally, just because there's so many question marks that I think intimidate me looking at a matchup that's at Lowell to kind of even the scales of it.
Let me ask you a couple questions on this game. It was interesting that you mentioned Norm Bazin seeing BU as the number one rival, at least back when he was a player. But there's absolutely no way that is reciprocal. BU's number one rival is BC. They probably don't feel the same in that direction. How much do you think about things like that unbalanced rivalry and motivation for teams?
Well, the late coach Sean Walsh always talked about this, because he always said that BU was their rival, even though, UNH was their rival, but they played their best games against BU. They were some of the most legendary games against BU back in the early 90s. So he always said, we don't see each other as our rivals, but these games are unreal. But then you have a school like Lowell. Listen, Merrimack should be their natural rival, but that series never really has kind of lived up to expectations. And some of these BU Lowell games have been unreal, especially in the last 10 years. So it's difficult, because I think that, even the coaches, Jay Pandolfo played against Norm Bazin, and this will be the first time that they get to face each other as coaches. I don't know if Jay Pandolfo will remember that there was some hatred and some vitriol when those two teams played back in the mid 90s. But if he does, then he'll probably be able to bring that up to his players and say that these guys are going to be a little bit more motivated to play you tonight. And it's one of those, there's so many mental games that go into hockey, into sports. And this is one that we kind of see play out, and rivals are rivals and rivals aren't rivals. And you're my rival, I'm not your rival, and all that stuff. It's all just a bunch of backstage baloney when you really come down to it. But you need to find ways to fire yourself up, and I say whatever you need to do to get your team going, that works.
One other question I want to ask, particularly thinking about this game, but also in general, when you look at the over-under at 5.5, how much consideration should you give to one team's propensity to take penalties in even majors? BU's had some penalty trouble in games this season. Is that something that might cause you to take a flyer at maybe taking the over on a game like that?
I would probably shy away from it, because that introduces a variable of you have to understand kind of what goes in between the lines on when the penalties get called. If you get a tight game called and versus a game that lets things go and then it explodes, or however those penalties are called, I tend to shy away from that in analysis, because you say, I know that the numbers skew a bit is on a team like BU, but but at the same time, if you're looking for reasoning, then that's certainly something to take under consideration. But I tend to kind of chalk that up and say, if a team is heavily penalized this early in the season, or if a team has taken majors or has taken something earlier in the season, I'm not necessarily factoring that in.
The one thing I do sometimes think about penalties a little bit, and whether you're disciplined and how many power plays you allow a game. But you also have to then go and conversely look at power play percentage. Right now, if you're thinking about BU taking a lot of penalties, Lowell's only converting at 16% on the power play. One of the lowest, lower in the country. We've talked about over these last few weeks about teams, UMass right now converting at 50% on the power play. Even BU themselves, I think they're around 20, 23, 24% on the power play. So I think that you have to look at the team that you're playing against and their conversion rate. I do know historically, having watched UMass Lowell, that they get their power play going eventually. It hasn't gotten to that point yet, but they'll get it going. So you don't want to give a team that has the potential too many opportunities with the man advantage.
We got 3 more games to look at, which we'll do after the break. USCHO Edge is sponsored by DCU, Digital Federal Credit Union. Visit dcu.org.
Know how people say life happens? Well, for me, life was happening, and I needed a new truck. I didn't have time to shop around for a good loan, so I got one from the dealer, higher interest and all. Month after month, those payments were squeezing me. So I went to DCU. They refinanced my loan and helped lower my rate, which lowered my payments. These days, I have more money in my pocket for whatever life throws at me. What will DCU mean to you? Insured by NCUA. Membership required. Visit dcu.org.
Back with USCHO Edge, I'm Ed Trefzger alongside Jim Connelly and Dan Rubin. Western Michigan, number 17 in this week's poll, is at number 4 Michigan. A huge margin for Michigan as a favorite in this one.
Obviously, sports books don't read all the controversy and backroom garbage that goes on between teams, because this is the revenge game for Western Michigan. Don't we remember that Michigan wouldn't play them last year, and that became a big deal, and it was part of the controversy that came up when Mel Pearson was let go as Michigan's coach. To make Western Michigan a plus 180 underdog on the road, Michigan at minus 220 favorite at home. Come on. These guys in Las Vegas didn't know all the backroom soap opera that was going on last November and December when they canceled that game against Western. So all that aside, I think that, the line still is a little bit too swayed toward the Wolverines. They've been good this year, and they are good. We know that they're good. But Western and Pat Firstweiler, he's had his team going. They'll be very motivated for this game, even if it's not the crap that they had to deal with last year around the ice, around the GLI. I still think that just the in-state rivalry alone for Western getting to play a Michigan team that they want to beat, that should be enough motivation that there's no way that they should be that big of a dog.
Dude, I was looking at this one. I kind of figured this is what I think is going to happen. I think on Friday, Michigan's going to win. I think Michigan's going to win on Friday at home. I'm even going to throw in there that Michigan's going to win handily, and there's probably going to be, a penalty in there that you just don't like, and the Western team's going to hate every second of it, and disagree. There'll probably be a yell from the bench or something like that. Not a nefarious penalty, obviously, but we're talking one of those ticky-tack calls that winds up on a power play and then a team scores. That's what I think is going to happen. And then we're going to turn around on Saturday in Kalamazoo, and Western Michigan is going to go absolutely nuts and win that game running away. I'm talking like a 3-1. That place is going to go insane. But we're not talking about the game on Saturday. We're talking about the game on Friday. And since I think weird things are going to happen on Friday, when I saw that line, I was just like, man, Michigan's a huge favorite given everything that's happening. You know what? Until Michigan loses a game that wasn't that 3-2 game to BU. I mean, given what they did last week, and until Michigan does something that makes me think otherwise, I touch anything that wasn't Michigan right now. I mean, they're just playing great hockey. I mean, that's the only thing I can come back to.
Over under is 6.5. If the over wins, it's going to be one heck of a game at Yost. But what do you think about that line? If it's the kind of game you guys have been talking about, especially Dan, where Michigan comes out firing on all cylinders, the over seems not so bad, but that's pretty high over under.
You're thinking about over under. You said if it hits, it'll be a heck of a game. Well, what if it's 9-2 again? Not the greatest game, and the over will hit by the end of the first period. That is a pretty high over under in terms of what we see in the season. I think it should be more. It is more in line with what we should be seeing at more games. Just the number of overs that have hit of late, but I like this number. I think it's actually a good number. I could see this being, if it's the type of game that Dan described, I see it being 5-2, 4-1. I don't see 9-2. I don't see another one of those games coming. Those are aberrations. But I do see if Western pulls off that kind of emotional win, that's, we fought as hard, I could see it being a 2-1, 3-2 game and going way under.
I really wish this weekend started at Western Michigan. I really wish that Friday game was at Western Michigan, but it's not. So I'm going to go with that's where I like the number 2. I actually like the over at 6.5 because, like I said, if we're dealing with one of those 5-2s, and I don't think the game is going to play out where it feels like a blowout. I just think the score on Friday, the playing at Yost, the home crowd for Michigan's playing some great hockey. The emotion, something for me, it feels like one of those games where in the second period, something's going to break the wrong way. And it's going to wind up being a 5-2 or a 6-3 type game that you look back and you're like, wow, that game was a lot closer than the score indicated.
There's a Big Ten matchup as number 16 Penn State travels to Wisconsin, 6.5 over under, and both teams, it's close to a toss-up, maybe a little advantage for Wisconsin at home. I've got to guess that any game Penn State is in, they're going to add a half or 1 to the over-under just because it's Penn State.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that anytime you have Penn State, bet the over. If you take them on the over for the entire season, you're going to make plus money. This is an interesting line where neither one's really favored. Minus 105 for Penn State, minus 125 for Wisconsin, and giving Wisconsin the favorite status, despite the fact that Penn State hasn't lost a game yet. That kind of does speak toward the fact that I think that there's not a lot of respect for how difficult Penn State's non-conference slate was to date. So I like the line here. I like Penn State to win. I think win straight outright. I think that they can beat Wisconsin. I think that what Wisconsin did last weekend is nice and probably looks pretty, and maybe gets the fan base back. Might even, quiet the rumors of firing a coach. But at this point, Wisconsin hasn't proven much. They beat a Minnesota Duluth team that's beating themselves right now. So I think that they've got to show within their league that they can compete. And this is a good series to start. Tough one against a Penn State team that I expect. I'm not sure that everybody expected them to be much coming into this year, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're a team that come the end of the year, they're in the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, and looking at Wisconsin too, I think that anytime you win a weekend, you have to take it, or sweep a weekend, you have to take into consideration what's happening on the other side. And you see this a lot in football and basketball at the beginning of the year when, a team, a crowd rushes the field because you beat the number 7 team in the country. And then at the end of the year, the number 7 team in the country is barely 500 or under 500. And then that you find out that the preseason ranking, the preseason assessment just wasn't rosy and wasn't pretty, and it wound up being an ugly year. You have to ask yourself at that point, was that loss a trigger point that sent the season into a downward spiral, or was that ranking were they not worthy of that ranking? Minnesota Duluth can't answer that right now. We're gonna see them over the course of the season, and we'll understand what those 2 wins look like for Wisconsin before the year is over, and kind of be able to do a hindsight 2020. But when you're looking at Wisconsin and the games that they've played well, but anything that you say before but is instantly negated. They just haven't proven it regularly enough. And given everything that we know about Penn State, the fact that it's not proven enough, you could play this game on a sheet of ice on a lake in the middle of January. And right now, I think Penn State would probably still win it running away with 4 or 5 goals in their back pocket just because of the way the offense plays. So I don't like Wisconsin here. Like I said, I'll probably eat my hat for that at a date to be determined, but I just don't like Wisconsin at all in this.
Well, let's turn to the final game on our list. Number 2, St. Cloud State at Bemidji State. Brett Larson's Huskies are 6-0, coming off a weekend sweep of Minnesota State. They got a bunch of first place votes in the poll this week. Meanwhile, Bemidji State, Tommy Serratori always prepares his teams well for big games, and they have shown how well they can play defensively. But St. Cloud State, a big favorite coming into Bemidji, and a 6-goal over-under.
I love the way St. Cloud has started the season. They were top 3 in my poll this week. They ended up falling at number 2. I think that what Brett Larson has gotten out of his team early here is proven that they're going to be there for the entire year. They're going to stay there. Bemidji State, that's a variable. And it's an early season variable. You've just beat Minnesota State, same league, and maybe you have that confidence, but it's the danger of becoming overconfident. And I've always thought that Brett Larson actually does a good job of keeping his team pretty level-headed. Remember seeing them in a regional a couple of years ago where they had to win 2 tough games. And after the first game, there was no emotional change. They just went out and played more business like the next night. And I think that, right now, I think that minus 195, it's a high price. I wouldn't want to pay it. But if you're going to have to bet this game, I'd still have to go with St. Cloud State. Over under 6, perfect number. I think it'll probably stay on the underside. But you just never know. One of these games, almost like what Dan was saying, sometimes one moment can just turn a game and make it go out of hand, and you can take a 1-0 or a 2-1 game late in the third and make it a 6-2 or something like that, and it goes over. But I like the under so far in this game.
Yeah, the under for me is kind of the sticking point, because looking at the number of shots that both teams allowed over the course of their first couple weekends. First, St. Cloud just doesn't allow a lot of shots. I think when you look at their numbers or what they have for their goalies, I think each of their goalies are averaging something like 16 or 17 saves in their wins. I don't think they have to do a whole lot to win a hockey game. I mean, they just don't allow that many shot attempts compared to what they're able to produce. But conversely, neither does Bemidji. Bemidji doesn't give up a lot of shots. I mean, Arizona State put up 20. I think Michigan Tech put up 20 or 25 in the tie, but they just don't allow a lot. Now, that said, if you're trying to find the winner and you're trying to pick a winner, I mean, you got to look at what St. Cloud did last week and feel like that was a major breakthrough. Based on what we were saying last week about St. Cloud, we were sitting here saying, they haven't beaten anybody. We don't know what they are. They're unproven. Minnesota State's battle tested. And now St. Cloud very much is battle tested and succeeded. So for the odds that you're given in the money line, I wouldn't touch that. I mean, that's a prohibitive. I mean, that line is just makes me not want to touch that. But from an over/under standpoint, you never want to root for the under. I mean, that you want to root for goals, you want to root for the excitement, but this is one of those matchups that's like, this is going to hit the under. This could hit the under pretty easily too. This could be like a 2-0 game, 3-1. I mean, this isn't going to be a whole lot.
One last question. When we think about over/under, so far this season, it seems like goal scoring is up. I don't have hard and fast numbers, but you look at some of these games when you see 7-4, 8-5 type scores, the 9-2 game with BU and Michigan. Is the overall trend something that would factor into your thoughts on over/under, or are you going to look just game by game?
I think you have to think about the trend. There's no way that you can just totally ignore it, but you have to then put it into the actual situation, the game situation, and kind of look at the two opponents as they're facing off against one another. And, you get certain teams out there, that can explode offensively, and it, Michigan being one of them. Go back to that 9-2 game. Like these teams can really pop and explode. So I think you have to think about that in games. And I think that's what Vegas is doing when you see a line, for a Western Michigan versus Michigan game of 6.5. I think that's one of the reasons you're seeing that number strictly because that you have at least one team that can absolutely just go off. We've seen a lot, and special teams, the numbers are high. I mean, we're a month into the season, and we have UMass with a 50% power play, North Dakota a 35.5% power play. You have 5 teams in the country, 30% or higher. You have another, let's call it 14 teams, 25% or higher. So you're talking about, if my math is right there, 19 teams in the country. 6 of them haven't even played yet. So 19 teams in the country with a power play that's clicking better than 1 in every 4. That's pretty high numbers. So we're seeing a lot of special teams goals. We're seeing a lot of early season penalties. I haven't gone through and done any tracking on penalties per game, but I'm going to guess the number of power plays per game is probably somewhere north of 8 total combined between the two teams. Whereas I think you get down toward the end of the season, you'll see that number probably reduces closer to like 5.5. So to add 3 power play opportunities a game, you're almost guaranteeing yourself at least 1 more goal a game. So that's just something you kind of have to consider is where does the special teams kind of factor into how many goals you think will be scored.
This is just anecdotal, but I have a feeling that we're seeing a few more majors so far this season because there's less reluctance to call those when you know you don't have to do a game misconduct or game disqualification. So I think that's factoring into the number of majors we're seeing.
Yeah, that hitting from behind and the contact from the head, contact to the head majors that automatically used to have a game misconduct with them. Taking that away, I think that referees are not happy, but less. They're more apt to call the penalty because there is less consequence. It's tough to call a hitting from behind 2 minutes into a game on a player and then know that you just took that player off the ice for 58 minutes. Yes, it's not a manpower situation, but you hear about a defenseman, when you dress 6D and your extra skater was a forward, you dress, and you lose a defenseman early, you're down to 5D in the first 2 minutes of the game. That can be really difficult. So I think that those are the types of penalties that we are still seeing. And we're seeing maybe a few more of. I feel like I have seen, again, you said it's anecdotal, Ed. I haven't done the research to make the evidence back this. I feel like we're seeing more majors a little bit, just not a ton, but I would say we've probably seen somewhere around 8 to 10% more majors at this point in the season.
Well, and the thing about a major penalty too is that you have to, if you do 1 more per game, you're taking away a full quarter of a period. So, you're even if it's 1 more that's called, not even 1 more per game, if it's 1 per every 2 games that gets called with that hitting from behind or something that's involved with it, that can, and there's 1 goal that's scored on the power play. That is, and even if there isn't a goal scored on the power play, that's taking away a goal that would have. I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's not turning into time that a goal would be scored for your opponent. So
you interrupt the flow of the game.
That's where I was going with it. And even if you're not taking away a goal, it impacts the scoring margin, which I know is up. There's the scoring margin. You've got, I think, 17 or 18 teams that are averaging a goal better than their opponents. And if you're factoring in the goals that then you're scored, when you have half of Division I currently averaging 3 goals per game, eventually there's going to be something that plays into it. Whether it holds or not, we won't know for another 3 or 4 weeks. But right now, we know that some of those numbers are up.
And beyond the flow of the game, there's also the implications of skating maybe 2 or 3 pairs of forwards that are your penalty killers and maybe your top 2 defensive pairs. You're getting them kind of worn out with the extra effort it takes on a PK for that amount of time. And that's going to affect you the rest of the game too. So yeah, some big impacts there. But you can read more about these games in Friday's USCHO Edge column from Jim, as we not only break down the games in more detail, but also show you the picks of our 8 Division I writers. And that comes out on Friday, also a little bit later in the day than this podcast, which you should see first thing in the morning. Well, you've already seen it, obviously, and heard it if you're at this point in it. So congratulations. Thank you for listening. We're going to wrap there. USCHO Edge is sponsored by DCU Digital Federal Credit Union. Visit dcu.org. You can find our podcasts at uscho.com/podcasts or subscribe on your favorite podcast app. We're available on Apple Podcasts, iHeart, Stitcher, Spreaker, and Spotify. For Jim Connelly and Dan Rubin, I'm Ed Trefzger, and this has been USCHO Edge.